Good evening. Welcome to our second talk of our series of talks on heritage. After yesterday's very interesting talk and comments and questions, in the end, we have the pleasure to receive Professor Lynn Meskell. I will not try to make even a brief presentation of all her research because it's extensive research. She comes from the Department of Anthropology of Stanford University. She was director for 6 years of the Department of Archaeology, and she has done extensive fieldwork and research in many countries around the world, as Egypt, Turkey, South Africa, Peru. So it has a very international experience of different cases on archaeology, excavations, and heritage. She has been doing also an institutional ethnography of UNESCO, so she will also bring her research on world heritage and all the questions that are around what is considered world heritage and all the specificities and all the problematics around it. Professor Lynn Meskell, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much. And now I give you the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. And I'd like to thank my hosts here at the Archaeology Center. And also, I really need to thank Professor Himanshu Ray, who first invited me to come to India several years ago and is really the reason I'm here and the reason that I'm interested in collaborating with Indian archaeologists and heritage practitioners and institutions more broadly. So thank you very much, Himanshu, for your inspiration. In the next couple of days, I will be talking on themes that are actually related to Himanshu's talk. Many of you were here for last evening. But the talk today is something slightly different. It's about archaeology, it's about interdisciplinarity, and materiality. So I'll be talking about the Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük, and we have one other event that is based around that long-term field project, a 25-year project in central Turkey. So I'll be giving talks that are on very, very different topics. So I'm talking today largely about the figurine work that I've been doing for the last 15 years on that site and the sorts of crossover work with other scholars that I hope will be of interest to people working on archaeology and archaeological science here. So if we look over the exciting new initiatives and publications that are devoted to objects of late, a central question remains unanswered for me. I guess I'm asking really why archaeology, the study of the human past through its material remains, has been largely omitted from this new canon of materiality studies. In this new wave of writing, and many of you may have seen these books that have come out, you will find literary theorists, geographers, and even classicists discussing the constitution of the object world and our human engagement with things. The BBC has just run, I think it's called the Museum of Lost Objects, talking about objects from partition. In the British Museum and in England generally, there's a huge obsession with what we can know through studying individual objects. But I think actually what I'm arguing for is that archaeology as a discipline has been omitted, has been sort of not included in the theorization of the object world, which is a very, very strange paradox for me. And it extends beyond a simple statement on the disciplinary standing of archaeology, the misplaced anxiety about theory in archaeology. Are we theoreticians or do we borrow from others? And it's also that theory in archaeology is often seen as derivative or weakly applied. But I think that's actually an outdated position now. And that I think we have proven quite convincingly that the past is very relevant to contemporary issues. So I suggest that that omission of an archaeological contribution is more revealing broadly about a scholarly reticence to engage with the messiness of things, their fundamental embeddedness, and their myriad historical residues and entanglements. So currently, ruminations on the object, I think, are squarely focused on freestanding things. When I said the objects from the objects that were partitioned between India and Pakistan, for example, this idea of focusing very narrowly on on freestanding, what I call freestanding objects, instead of thinking in more complicated ways about their contexts and other substances. And some of the idiosyncratic case studies we've seen in, for example, the object reader. There are all of these books now that have come out on objects, stuff, for example. None of them really including archaeologists at all. And you can see very clearly that what they focus on is a rock, a pixel, a tricycle, a surfboard, a snow shaker. I mean, it's very trendy, it's very hip, but it's actually, in some ways, deeply superficial. Now, I think this selectivity frees us up to imagine the multiple meanings that radiate out from objects, rather than the materials, the substances, the things, and the settings that co-produce them. The object in and of itself, then, is manifest as a salient set of representations and significations reflecting histories, politics, personalities, and so on. And they're kind of read off the artifact. And this is what I call a centripetal perspective, that the chosen thing resides at the center, and then it has this primacy, and it's elevated to a different status, whereas its co-products and the matrices in which it's embedded are rendered secondary and supplemental. One way of thinking about this is evinced by the popular theme of object biographies, which, you know, over the last decade, a lot has been written about in archaeology. It's considered the afterlife of objects beyond their initial crafting, and this has been taken up a lot also in museum studies. And here I'm thinking of the work of Thomas Turkle, who you see here, Sherry Turkle, and Christopher Gosden. It's the we make things, not just at the moment of creation, but over and over again as we layer histories of meaning onto objects. These dense genealogies can be traced and unpacked. And then there's another strand of scholarship that things make us. Maybe I'll just go back to look at Danny Miller's work here. It's an anthropological concern with the product of self-making through things, that we build our identity through acquisition of things, and that things make us as human beings. And this is best highlighted by the anthropological concern with the project of self-making through things as and constitutive material culture. There's Burke's book, Lifebuoy Men, Lux Women, or Janet Hoskins, and also Danny Miller's many, many books, probably 30 or 40 books on this topic. Other productive directions have followed Marcel Mauss, who successfully reimagined object agency, and this dilutes further the subject-object or maker-made bifurcation. Here you can think of the work of Alfred Gell, again Chris Gosden. And in some of these domains, archaeological evidence has been convincingly brought into play. However, most often, this has been achieved with very visually evocative, complex, historical, and ethnographic data. So very charismatic objects are talked about when it comes to archaeology. But I want to return now to that opening question of mine of why archaeology doesn't provide for the stuff of materiality in this broad, emergent, very cross-disciplinary audience, from sociologists to classicists to philosophers. Is it that we have fallen short in our intellectual contribution, or have we actually succeeded in demystifying our objects so completely as to render them mundane? One thought is that archaeology is simply too gritty, and that the focus on exposing context, spatiotemporal matrices, and the material networks that surround objects, their literal and metaphorical embeddedness, is just overwhelming. And anyone who's worked on a very large excavation will understand what I'm talking about. So contemporary archaeology has moved away from a purely or purist object approach, object-centered approach, and now it concerns itself with multiple associations, layerings, scalar analyses, and entanglements. So my own work here on Neolithic figurines from Çatalhöyük was once the domain of artistic interpretations and quasi-religious imaginings. But instead of doing that kind of work, my own is situated within diachronic spatial analyses, clay sourcing and manufacture. And it similarly involves ascertaining the volumes of midden deposits of what we sieve, dry sieve from excavations, comparisons with the faunal assemblages, the different sorts of species that are represented, considerations of the human body and shape that we get from isotopic data, extracted from human bone, and so on. So in archaeology, such chains of evidence and associations build a greater richness and understanding of things. But in doing so, perhaps things lose their boundedness, where the object starts and the context begins, their discrete qualities, and what makes them special or separate. So looking across disciplines, what I see is a great romance developing around things. It's a kind of captivation, fetishization, that people are looking at objects, they're talking about gifts, money, gadgets, toys, blankets, birds' nests. All these things have been, this is a quote, all these things are being described, they're seen as fascinating by anthropologists. The London School of Material Culture Studies has made enormous strides in taking things seriously. But it's always the abundant stuff of modern life that they're looking at. And either in its banality or its glory. And they take materiality as a set of cultural relationships that explore the constitution of the object world and its shaping of human experience. Now, many of these scholars that I'm talking about were actually trained as archaeologists. So Danny Miller, Chris Tilley, Victor Buckley were all trained in Cambridge as archaeologists. So why is it's even more noticeable that they have sidelined their original discipline and moved on to do something else. Danny Miller has actually said, and I quote, "There is no academic discipline whose specific area of study would be artifacts, the object world created by humanity," unquote. Now, I think that's rather remarkable because I always thought that that's what archaeologists did. So he says there is no academic discipline. In Miller's recent account, the entire discipline of archaeology is cast as a parody of exoticism, lost civilization, his own drunken expeditions, coupled with an overweening love of pottery. I actually think he did his PhD work. Yeah, right. So Miller's recent books present microethnographies of individual attachments to things, the centrality of stuff within modern life, and they also exemplify the scholarly turn to the social life of things and our own entanglements. And this is this is the very reason I began my own book on archaeological materiality with the qualification that I was not doing a book about coffee cups, coffee mugs, madeleines, wedding rings, why you pick certain cars, artworks by Duchamp. These are cliched examples that feature in many, many of these books. What I'm saying is that archaeologists might offer different perspectives from this vantage of studying materials and contexts and all of these associations, which is not to say that we do something better, but we do something different. And it's a perspective that has a time depth of its own. So the process of archaeology in its methodology and interpretation remind us of Hegel's discussion of the associative quality of thinghood, but also Webb Keane, who's an anthropologist in Michigan, his idea of bundling. Archaeologists must necessarily operate within the framework of the assemblage, and we have the techniques to traverse archaeological science, materials analysis, and social theory. Now, Ian Hodder has argued that prior materiality studies, as I mentioned earlier, focus on evocative things, very charismatic things, or object agency, rather than probing the actual constitution of things, how people were entrapped by their material surroundings, trapped into maintaining them as they falter, fail, decay, and so on. And you can see this wall at Çatalhöyük, this wall that has slumped over and over again, many, many layers of plastering, the enormous amount of maintenance that goes into these sorts of buildings. And from his experience working at this site, he inverts the dominant view that suggesting that artifacts entrap people in long-term relationships of material investment, care, and maintenance. In fact, people become so entangled, they are domesticated by things. Now, the Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük is 7,100 to 6,000 BCE, and the examples that he uses are maybe not the evocative objects that the site might be famous for. He uses clay sourcing and brick making, early domestication of cereals, development of pottery for cooking, and types of food that this afforded, and so on. An archaeological sensibility thus offers a certain methodological fetishism, to echo Arjuna. It requires following the things themselves, following them in these kind of chains almost, starting from their constitution rather than just their aesthetic properties or what they symbolize, their representations. So for the rest of the presentation, I am going to ask what a prehistoric materiality would look like. If we take materiality, that concept, to be the underlying philosophy of an engagement with the material world that is operative in a particular cultural context, how would prehistory be different, if at all, from these historic and contemporary settings that so much has been published about? Moreover, what might it mean methodologically to examine materiality in deep prehistory, where there's no textuality, no leverage from the written evidence, and no informants to ask? And so we might indeed pay closer attention to the life world of things. We should not assume that this means less data or more license for imagination, but that we are inclined to be more archaeological in our approach, to reveal the layers, to pay attention to the processes, trace the circulation of things, particularly discard, which is very important for the material I work on, and the multiple lives of objects within and across landscapes. But is addressing prehistory in the materiality of prehistory more difficult or just different? And when I decided to work at the site of Çatal in central Turkey, several colleagues expressed a certain satisfaction to me that I would now experience the difficulties of writing social archaeology in a context with no texts, no houses and tombs like I had written about in Egypt. My prior work was on New Kingdom Egypt. So you had all the texts, you knew who lived in houses, you knew people's names, their relationships, and so on. But what Çatal lacks in its written sources, it more than makes up for in the richness of its contextual archaeology. The range and depth of repetitive practices that we see across the settlement, and the complex retrieval of its diverse evidentiary sources from the intensely micro to macro scales. So this is a vast project, as I said, over 150 specialists working for now as the final of 25 years. And it's very interesting for us. We've had many projects that involve social anthropologists, philosophers, religious scholars come to the site. And one social anthropologist, Webb Keane, who I mentioned before, who's written a lot about materiality, admit that they were drawn to this project because, and he says, of the fascinating evidentiary problems posed by archaeological work. He says, in Çatalhöyük, the materials seem both rich and recalcitrant. And he says, it's surprising to me how sophisticated the new technologies in archaeology have become, unquote. And I think this is an idea that many of my colleagues in other fields struggle with. How can you say and do all of these things? You know, we thought archaeology was literally just a hole in the ground. So obviously things have changed there too. Now, Çatalhöyük was identified by archaeologist James Mellart in the 1950s, and it became popular and famous through his publications from the 1960s excavations. The site became known for its distinctive architecture that you can see here, its art and symbolism, largely because Mellart did very evocative visual reconstructions and narratives. Now, new excavations, the project I'm talking about, is directed by Ian Hodder. It began in 1993, and it has challenged many of Mellart's sensational claims and associations. However, much of the site still remains associated with controversial narratives of prehistoric matriarchy and mother goddess worship. And this is Linda Evangelista modeling the famous so-called mother goddess figurine from Çatal that James Mellart found. So this has a ridiculous sort of afterlife. If you were going to do that study, the afterlife of images, that particular one, which has a whole history that I could talk about in question time, is a fascinating example. Of course, it tells us nothing like this, of course. Now, these ideas of matriarchy were forged around the discovery of clay and stone figurines from the site, particularly these corpulent female forms, which, as I can show of less than 5% of the entire assemblage, and yet that is what has captivated people's attention. They do anthropomorphic examples of figurines do not dominate the site, and we'll see what does in a minute. They are certainly more identifiable than many of the other examples we have, but they have been taken as central, and so actually this idea of the visual nature of these figurines has actually skewed the 95% of the figurines that we find. And we have, I think, now over 3,000 figurines, which is a huge number for any Neolithic site. Just as a comparison, in the Greek Neolithic, if a site has 30 figurines, you know, that's quite a big deal. So we have over 3,000. Now, what does predominate are these sorts of things, are animal figurines. And if we look at these examples pictured here, this is 6 cattle figurines that are of unfired clay, and they're from a 9,000-year-old matrix of earth and domestic debris. Their makers intended that each of the figurines would represent wild cattle, yet they were hastily made and roughly shaped, although they do all very carefully delineate the tail of each animal. At Çatalhöyük, we see the heads and tails of all animals that are shown as figurines were the salient markers of animality across an array of media, from wall paintings to figurines and installations. All figurines found in this one archaeological unit were broken in some way. They were stabbed or punctured, others malformed. They were also included or dumped in an assemblage of animal bones, potsherds, chipstone, organic matting, and other debris to constitute the fill for a raised platform in the southwest corner of Building 49. So this is the matrix that they came out of. So this is the actual sort of daily life or afterlife of figurines. Now, these platforms are constructed and repeatedly plastered white. Sometimes later they became places of internment. So they are built and then successively dug down into to place the dead. Some platforms become a site for human remains, but also this mixing with other artifacts, animal bones, house sweepings, and debris. I mean, this is all intentional in some way. So these are all made platforms, as it were. So people are choosing the composition of those as they go along. And here, I think, lies a window into the cultural history of the Neolithic. Its natural taxonomies between people and things, or people and animals, this mixing in a burial context, was radically different to our own views, and yet entirely sensible and legible within the Neolithic life world. It's one of embeddedness, connectivity, again, a blurring between the categories of things, blurring between the living and the dead, and these sort of gritty, broken down, falling apart objects that are not fired. They may not be made to last. They've only lasted, as it were, almost by accident. Now, Building 49, we don't call them homes or houses, but Building 49 was a small structure. It was lived in for a considerable period of time. It has numerous successive wall plasterings and associations, and also a good number of people buried within the house walls. Along with my colleague Kari Nakamura, I've argued that this building seems to have a strong association with animals, not just those of a representational nature like the figurines, but with living animals. And within the building fill, these are houses that are collapsed in and then fill up with dirt, with soil. There are also the remains of living animals. So excavators here found several horn cores, cattle horn cores, some of which were also plastered to materially emulate their living or fleshed state. There was also a very high proportion of sheep and goat bones. So this is what I'm talking about. This is a building that also has other very clear animal associations. Now, wild cattle were immensely significant at Çatalhöyük. They dominated large painted murals that some of you may have seen. Their skulls were plastered and painted, and their horns were installed on benches like you see here. Some also emerged out of house walls. The inhabitants of the settlement plastered these cattle remains to revivify them, to make them more lifelike. Again, remember I said there's a focus on heads and tails. So the heads and horns were the most important here, and they protruded from many surfaces or even floors. And this materially inserted their presence into human daily affairs. Now this is the 6 animal figurines, as it were, sort of cleaned up a little more, the sort of fragments of. Now you can see that nobody is going to put these on the front of Linda Evangelista's clothing. They may not be sensational, but this is what 95% of the assemblage actually is more like. So in the particular makeup of the platform in Building 49, we have these quadruped figurines. We also have an unusual assemblage of small mammal bones. There are 3 different species of birds. There's a large amount of eggshell which has been preserved, fish bone, equid, pig, deer, and dog bones, small quantities of cattle bone, antler, turtle shell, a hedgehog bone, 3 juvenile sheep, and so on. Now, these concentrations of eggshells are interesting, as well as little caches of whole crushed egg in the platform. Now, these were all intentionally deposited. Taken together, we might imagine that the occupants of the house were successfully engaged in hunting, herding, and gathering practices. But we might also equally imagine that these material remains of animals, faunal and figural, were also the stuff of possible magical manipulation or ritual activities. There was a powerful concern here for the material manipulation that can be also seen in the figurines themselves. Figurines were not just simply vehicles or for social practices. We can't just say they're conduits or proxies. And here again I follow Keane, who says that such things can never be reduced only to the status of evidence for something else, such as beliefs or other cognitive phenomena. As material things, they are enmeshed in causality, they're registered in and induced by their forms, and as forms, they remain objects of experience. As objects, they persist across contexts and beyond any particular intentions and projects. So whatever we think of them now is probably may have nothing to do with how they were thought of in the past. So this ability to traverse time. Their materializations bear the marks of their temporality, he says. Now, while these sorts of quadrupeds were rather expediently made, this slide shows a range of examples of different species that we have. The fact that our 6 cattle figurines were deposited in such a way and sealed into this platform that was plastered over might indicate a concern for a greater longevity for their, again, to maybe think about a more ritualized reason for their making. So they might have been made very quickly, a rapid manufacture. They're easily recognizable as animal forms. The makers of the figurines always emphasize the angular, fleshy forms of cattle. They focus on their torsos, and then the distinctive tails. There is not much emphasis on legs, for example. So we see this over several thousand years and over thousands of examples. What we can say is that the clay that was used to mold our examples was relatively clean. It is largely inclusion-free and highly malleable. It's even been suggested that the reason for people settling at the site in the first place was to take advantage of these rich clay sources. Recent work by faunal analyst Louise Martin and myself suggests that Neolithic figurine makers model quadrupeds, deer and cattle primarily, on the palm of their hand, possibly even their left hand from the way they're shaped, and there are distinctive marks that correspond to the palm and fingers. Now, some of these examples were never completed, others were halted in progress or partly destroyed. We have intentional puncture marks that you can see on this equid, this horse-like figure here. Piercing, and there are also marks that might indicate food sharing or partitioning of meat, like this example. So which it has been cut, very, very cleanly cut, probably with an obsidian blade while it was still wet. So animal figurines, like most of the anthropomorphic examples, were, as I said, expediently, quickly made and inevitably discarded. Rather than revered in burials, they were not included in human burials, they were not placed in niches, they were not buried in caches as other classes of objects were. Obsidian, ceramics, and ground stone were treated in those ways. Figurines not. So I think, again, this has to make us think differently about categories. What we can say of the hundreds and hundreds of examples of animal figurines that we have excavated after a complete spatial analysis is that they were primarily found in middens and building fill, and this is all secondary deposition. What I suggest is the act of making the figurines that were significant rather than the notion of them as a final product, and they were also not fired like the pottery, and they may have never been intended to really endure. So think back to why those ones sealed in the platform might be different. But generally, most of our figurines end up basically in the rubbish or house fill and are buried. So the activities associated with building 49 might appear then to be highly ritualized to our modern eyes. But it's important to remember that they are part of a suite of repetitive practices that we see across the site for a millennium, suggesting that figural practices were not radically set apart from everyday life. Given the many hundreds of animal forms that we have uncovered, I would suggest that figurine making is part of quotidian activities. It's constituted in everyday life. It's not something that was highly religious or highly specialized. Everybody was making these objects. So representing and engaging with animals occupied a central role in the Çatalhöyük life world, and extended to social, economic, historical, and spiritual realms. But we can go further than this by using archaeological techniques to comment on species specificity, in particular arenas of social life. So employing the results of faunal analysis, we can determine what types of animals were salient in different contexts, whether representational spheres or in actual domestic consumption. So some early work by Russell and Mies demonstrated that wild cattle, like those represented in our 6 figurines, make up 54% of all faunal remains placed in installations or special deposits at the site. Remember these sort of the horns that are protruding from walls and floors and so on. Wild cattle also dominate in the wall reliefs, 46%, but they surprisingly only constitute a very small 15% of the animal remains that were consumed on site. So they're largely in this symbolic realm of wall paintings and installations. They were highly prized as materializations, but they actually only comprised a small proportion of the diet. Now, if you contrast this with domestic sheep, they make up 56% of the site's faunal remains, and the bulk of meat consumption for the people that live there. Yet these animals, domestic sheep, were not considered symbolically salient in the elaboration of village houses. So we don't see them in wall paintings, for example. They only feature in 19% of the wall reliefs and 13% of installations and deposits. So if we tack back and forward between the objects and related data sets, this allows us some vantage on Neolithic thinking about materializing certain categories of things: wild cattle versus domestic sheep, clay versus plaster and paint. The materials and properties I've just described characteristically form clusters with other phenomena that are historical in character. Animal imagery, figurines, this fascination with wild cattle, the installation of plastered faunal elements as you see here, this is from building 72, and also shares a dense web of connections with anthropomorphic figurines, headless figurines, human skull removal and plastering, and other objects in material culture. We have to create these kind of networks. And these associations continue with considerable resilience over the centuries in domestic buildings, and they're repeated and constructed one on top of each other. So the houses are all layered, and sometimes these practices continue through those layerings. I'll talk a bit more about sort of head removal between human and animal, but there's definitely a connection. You can see also this is, I think, a sheep head that's been plastered into the wall on this side. Maybe I'll do this. Yeah, on this side here, this is a sheep head, and then you've got these large bucrania here at the bottom. But again, it's this idea of heads, human heads, animal heads. We can come back to that in a bit. So I've also suggested at Çatal that the greatest parallels actually occur between humans and cattle, the representation of those two groups in material traditions. They occupy the most attention. They are both shaped, modeled, painted in 2 and 3 dimensions, as I just mentioned, like these bucrania. So this is how I'm trying to think about different practices and objects informing a much more connected way of looking at things. And I've previously talked about and published one very evocative materialization of this assemblage, and it's shown in this idea of cattle and human heads, and it's shown in this remarkable ceramic vessel. It's inscribed on the surface, molded and incised with cattle and human heads together that mutually constitute each other. So the horns of the bull form the eyebrows of the human face, while the human ears also form those of the bull when the vessel is turned. So again, there's this embodied element to it. In the past, archaeologists would have typically classified this object as pottery, and it ends up being in the pottery lab. In fact, it took many years before this was all put together, and they would consider it distinct from the taxonomies that I deal with, figurines, plaster bucrania, and faunal remains. So we need to put all of these different groups, as it were, back together again. And I think by paying attention to prehistoric materiality, to the constitution of the Neolithic life world, and tracing these material instantiations that suture together, that stitch together objects and philosophies that we might otherwise separate out as separate or discrete. In all these ways, we can see animals as conduits and connections, that their materialities are also deeply connected to other objects and embedded within wider practices and beliefs. Animals the ones that I deal with, are specifically on a miniature scale, can be held in the hand. They're made from clay that's around 100 meters in sort of radius around the site, so it's freely available. They were made in public areas. We get clay scrap in external areas, in midden areas. So this is all very publicly available. They were very handleable, widely circulated, very portable. They could have been worn, contained in pouches. We have leather pouches, for example. And this miniature quality allows them to do what real animals, plastered animal figurine installations, those things in the walls, and wall paintings themselves cannot do. They are allowed, because of their miniature status, they socialize, they facilitate embodied and immediate interaction between humans and this idea of wild animals. They were active things, and their small scale enabled an intimacy, control, and democratization of experience that was not possible with large-scale narrative wall paintings that only existed in a couple of houses. So only a few people would ever have got to see those. And the plaster bucrania that must have been retrieved after hunting. Not everybody could go hunting, not everybody was successful. Everybody could make figurines. And so this is the distinction. These are the sorts of houses that would have had wall paintings. As I said, a very small percentage from the site. In our 25 years, we have never found a wall painting like this one. This is from a reconstruction from Mellart's, because he hacked through 250 houses at a great speed, and we have not. So, this is obviously a very rare occurrence, whereas that stands in distinction to figurine production. So the images of wild beasts that are represented on this scale dwarf human actors, whereas if you look at the size of this wild animal versus the humans around. So the scalar thing is completely different. So in this case, human beings are dwarfed, whereas the plastered faunal remains, the things that are coming out of the walls that I showed you from Building 72 and Building 49, they are absolutely one-to-one scale. They're obviously lifelike, and they also facilitate a kind of lived interaction. But the figurines are the opposite again. They demand to be regularly handled, manipulated, and mastered. And this reduction in size demands closer scrutiny and embodied proxemics. And that intimacy might enable new ways of seeing and potentially understanding subjects. And I argue that these miniature animals are effectively connected to and enlivened and made real these very major beastly subjects, some of which must have had historic or mythic characteristics. So through this brief contribution, I hope to have sketched some potentials inhering in the topic of prehistoric materiality. By attending to things, by following them in an archaeological sense, the discipline of archaeology offers a different vantage on material histories and culture. For example, understanding the priorities of figurine makers might enable us some insight into indigenous taxonomies that transcend those that we moderns consider natural. While the material groundedness or embeddedness of things is central, so too is the very process of crafting the thing. And in terms of figurines, their making, their manipulation was an everyday performance that was salient, if not that making was more important than the end product or the end product surviving in some way. These things were not put on platforms or stuck on niches or worshipped or whatever. It was the making that was so important. So the group of animal figurines that we looked at that were deposited in the platform in Building 49 may be exemplars of an extended object efficacy that continued after their final deposition. And so while scholars cannot always determine a priori the precise meanings or salience of things for individuals, whether in the deep past or even in contemporary settings, in the case of Çatalhöyük, we can stitch together some strands of Neolithic practice, preoccupation, and preference. So here is the example I also gave of the scalar difference, what might be relegated to memory, what might be history, and what might be also in the present. So the complexity of archaeological context at Çatal, I think, reveals a rich potential for multi-layering of the constitution of the material world. As Baudrillard famously noted, despite our modern mythology of a liberation of forms, we cannot be liberated quite so easily. Our task is not to free them, but to capture them, to make them relate to each other, and to generate each other. Uncovering prehistoric materiality may indeed be different from art history, from anthropology, or cultural studies approaches to things, but they are no less theorized or sophisticated. We simply draw on different bodies of evidence. We interpolate a relational approach to things with the acknowledgement that our objects and substances are contextually embedded. That perspective, I would argue, has much to offer our current studies of materiality by seeking to go beyond individual things and more fully understand cultural histories of the material world. So thank you very much for your attention.